At my wedding altar, with 300 guests watching, my mother Victoria stood up and screamed, "Stop this madness." Her voice echoed through the historic chapel like a gunshot. But what she didn't know was that my billionaire father-in-law Harrison Townsend was standing right behind her, and he'd been investigating our family for months. What he revealed next would destroy everything my mother had built and change my life forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Natalie Brooks, and this is the story of how my wedding day became the day I finally discovered who I really was. The morning of my wedding dawned crisp and golden over Charleston's historic district. Magnolia blossoms perfumed the September air, and Spanish moss swayed gently from ancient oak trees that had witnessed countless love stories. I should have felt like a princess. Instead, I felt like an imposter preparing for the performance of my lifetime. Standing in the bridal suite at Magnolia Plantation, I stared at my reflection in the antique mirror while my sister Sophia adjusted the pearl buttons on my vintage lace gown. The dress had belonged to my grandmother Rose, the only person in our family who had ever made me feel truly valued. She'd passed away 2 years earlier, leaving behind more questions than answers about our family's past. "You look beautiful, Nat," Sophia whispered, her voice carrying that familiar note of careful affection she always used when our mother was nearby. At 25, Sophia had mastered the art of loving me just enough to appear sisterly, but never enough to upset the delicate balance Victoria had constructed in our household. Victoria Brooks stood by the window, her steel gray hair pulled into a perfect chignon, wearing a navy Chanel suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. She was on her third phone call of the morning, her voice sharp and commanding as she coordinated last-minute details with the wedding planner. Every few minutes, her pale blue eyes would dart toward me in the mirror, and I could see her calculating something behind that practiced smile. "The flowers are wrong," she announced, snapping her phone shut. "I specifically ordered white roses and baby's breath, not these gaudy peonies. This is what happens when we compromise on vendor." Rachel Kim, my wedding coordinator and one of my few genuine friends, looked up from her clipboard with barely concealed frustration. "Mrs. Brooks, we discussed this last month. Natalie specifically requested the peonies because they were her grandmother's favorite." Victoria's laugh was like ice cracking. "Rose had many favorites, dear, most of them inappropriate for a wedding of this caliber. We're marrying into the Townsend family, not hosting a garden party in some backwater town." I caught Sophia's eye in the mirror. She gave me the smallest shake of her head. A warning I'd learned to read over 28 years of walking on eggshells around our mother. "Don't fight this battle," her expression said. "Not today." But something rebellious stirred in my chest. Maybe it was the weight of grandmother's dress, or the memory of her voice telling me stories about true love conquering all obstacles. Maybe it was the knowledge that in 2 hours I'd be Miss Marcus Townsend, wife to a man whose family's wealth could buy and sell our entire neighborhood 10 times over. "The peonies stay," I said quietly, still looking at myself in the mirror. "They're perfect." Victoria's reflection appeared behind mine, her hands coming to rest on my shoulders with the kind of pressure that looked affectionate, but felt like a warning. "Darling, I know you're nervous, but let's not make decisions based on sentiment. The Townsends will notice every detail. We can't afford to look quaint." There it was, the word she'd been using my entire life to describe anything I loved that didn't fit her vision of respectability. My art was quaint. My job at the community center was quaint. My choice to attend the state university instead of an Ivy League school had been devastatingly quaint. I turned to face her directly, something I rarely did. "Mother, it's my wedding. I think I can choose my own flowers." Her smile tightened, and I saw Sophia physically step backward. Rachel suddenly became very interested in her clipboard. The silence stretched until it felt dangerous. "Of course, sweetheart," Victoria finally said, her voice honey-sweet, but her eyes Arctic. "It's your special day. We just want everything to be perfect for you and Marcus." She moved away to examine the wedding shoes lined up near the door, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor like a countdown timer. I knew that tone. I knew that retreat. It meant she was planning something. And whatever it was, I wouldn't like it. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Can't wait to see you walk down that aisle. Beautiful. Dad flew in this morning. And he's excited to officially welcome you to the family. I smiled despite the tension in the room. Marcus Townsend was everything good and genuine that I'd never expected to find in a man whose trust fund could fund small countries. We'd met at a charity auction where I was volunteering, and he was reluctantly attending at his mother's insistence. While other men in his social circle seemed to view women as accessories or investments, Marcus saw me as a partner. He'd proposed on the beach where we'd had our first real conversation, getting down on one knee in the sand with a ring that had belonged to his great-grandmother. His father, Harrison, was another story entirely. The man who'd built Townsend Industries from a small shipping company into a global empire was intimidating in the way that only true power could be. He was polite to me, even warm at times, but I always felt like he was studying me, looking for cracks in my foundation. Marcus assured me his father was just protective, that he'd grown to love me once he got to know me better. What I didn't know was that Harrison had been doing far more than getting to know me. Rachel cleared her throat gently. We should head over to the chapel soon. The photographer wants to get some shots of you walking through the gardens before the ceremony. I nodded, taking one last look at myself in grandmother's dress. The lace was delicate but strong, aged to a warm ivory that made my dark hair look richer and my green eyes brighter. I'd chosen to wear it because it made me feel connected to the woman who'd believed in love stories and happy endings, even when her own life had been marked by loss and struggle. As we gathered our things and prepared to leave the bridal suite, Victoria's phone rang again. She answered with her usual crisp efficiency, but I caught the change in her tone immediately. What do you mean they're asking questions? I thought we handled this months ago. Her voice dropped to a hiss, and she stepped into the hallway for privacy. Sophia looked at me with worried eyes. Nat, is everything okay? Mom's been acting strange all week. Before I could answer, Victoria returned, her face composed but pale. Time to go, girls. We don't want to keep our guests waiting. The walk to the chapel felt surreal. Magnolia Plantation was breathtaking in the morning light, with its sprawling gardens and moss-draped trees, creating a fairy tale backdrop. Guests were already arriving, and I could see the parking area filling with luxury cars that probably cost more than most houses. The Townsend family had spared no expense, despite my protests that I wanted something smaller and more intimate. The guest list had swollen to 300 people, most of whom I'd never met. Business associates, society friends, political connections. It felt more like a corporate merger than a celebration of love. But as we approached the chapel and I saw Marcus waiting near the entrance in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, my nerves settled. He was talking with his father Harrison, a distinguished man in his 60s, whose silver hair and sharp eyes gave him the look of someone accustomed to controlling boardrooms and bending others to his will. When Marcus saw me, his face lit up with such pure joy that I remembered why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. You look incredible, he said, taking my hands and spinning me around gently. Grandmother's dress was the perfect choice. Wait until you see her walking down the aisle, Harrison said, his voice warm but his eyes still studying. It's going to be quite a moment. Victoria stepped forward, extending her hand to Harrison with her most charming smile. Mr. Townsend, everything looks absolutely perfect. Thank you for making this day so special for our families. Please, call me Harrison, he replied, shaking her hand but holding it, perhaps a moment longer than necessary. We're about to be family. After all, I'm looking forward to our conversation after the ceremony. Something flickered across Victoria's face too quick for most people to catch, but I'd spent a lifetime reading her micro-expressions. It looked like fear. Of course, she said smoothly. I'm sure we'll have plenty to discuss. Rachel appeared at my elbow with a gentle touch. It's time, Natalie. Your father is waiting in the vestibule. I kissed Marcus goodbye and followed Rachel toward the chapel entrance, where my father Richard stood adjusting his tie with nervous fingers. At 55 he still carried himself like the college professor he'd been before Victoria convinced him to join her interior design business. He'd never seemed entirely comfortable in the world of wealth and social climbing that my mother navigated so effortlessly. "Ready, sweetheart?" he asked, offering me his arm. His voice was gentle, and I could see genuine emotion in his brown eyes. "Ready as I'll ever be, Dad." The chapel was stunning. White roses and peonies created cascading arrangements at the altar, and candles flickered in every window. The September light streamed through stained glass, painting rainbow patterns across the assembled guests. I could see familiar faces from both families, though the Townsend side dominated with their elegant attire and unmistakable air of privilege. As the wedding march began and we started down the aisle, I felt like I was floating. This was it. The moment I'd dreamed of since childhood. My father squeezed my arm reassuringly, and I could see Marcus at the altar, his eyes bright with tears of happiness. But as we reached the halfway point, I noticed Harrison Townsend standing in the front row, his expression uncharacteristically serious. He was holding what looked like a manila folder, and his gaze wasn't on me. It was fixed directly on my mother. Victoria sat rigidly in her seat, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Sophia beside her looked confused, glancing between her mother and Harrison with growing concern. We were almost at the altar when Harrison stepped forward, clearing his throat loudly enough to be heard over the music. The organist, confused, began to slow the tempo. "Excuse me," Harrison said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Before we proceed, there's something that needs to be addressed." My father and I stopped walking. The chapel fell silent except for the rustle of 300 people turning to stare. Marcus looked bewildered, his eyes darting between his father and me. "Dad, what are you doing?" Marcus called out, his voice tight with embarrassment. But Harrison ignored his son, his steely gaze still fixed on Victoria. "Mrs. Brooks, I believe you have something that belongs to my future daughter-in-law." Victoria rose slowly from her seat, her face cycling through emotions, confusion, anger, and something that looked dangerously close to panic. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand what you're talking about. This is my daughter's wedding, and I really think—" "Stop this madness." Victoria suddenly exploded, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "You have no right to come here and make accusations on my daughter's wedding day. This is a sacred ceremony, not some business transaction." Her voice echoed through the chapel, sharp and desperate. Guests began murmuring. Phones appeared to capture the drama, and I felt my carefully planned perfect day tilting off its axis. But Harrison didn't flinch. If anything, he looked satisfied, like Victoria had just confirmed something he'd suspected all along. "Actually, Miss Brooks," he said, opening the manila folder in his hands, "this became my business. The moment you decided to steal from my future daughter-in-law's inheritance. The moment you forged documents to claim property that rightfully belongs to her. The moment you convinced her that she was worth less than nothing, when she's actually worth millions." The chapel erupted. Guests gasped and whispered. Phones started recording, and I felt my legs go weak. My father's grip on my arm tightened, his face draining of color. "That's impossible," I whispered, but my voice was lost in the chaos. Victoria's mask finally slipped completely. "You don't know what you're talking about. Rose left everything to the family business. Natalie was just a child when she died. Rose Brooks left everything to her granddaughter Natalie," Harrison continued, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "The trust fund, the properties, the investment accounts, all of what she didn't leave was permission for you to forge Natalie's signature on transfer documents when she turned 8. What she didn't leave was the right for you to steal nearly $3 million and use it to fund your lifestyle while convincing your daughter she was a burden on the family finances." The world tilted. I heard myself make a sound, half gasp, half sob, but it felt like it was coming from someone else. Marcus was moving toward me, his face stricken, but everything seemed to be happening underwater. $3 million, I breathed. Harrison nodded grimly. "Conservative Your grandmother was far wealthier than your mother wanted you to know. She left detailed instructions that the inheritance was to be turned over to you on your 25th birthday. with interest. That was 3 years ago. Natalie. I turned to look at Victoria, who was standing frozen in the center aisle like a deer caught in headlights. Her perfectly styled hair had come loose, and her Chanel suit suddenly looked like armor that had failed to protect her. Mom, my voice cracked on the word. Is it true? For a moment, I thought she might deny it. I thought she might have some explanation that would make sense of this nightmare. Instead, she lifted her chin with the defiance I'd seen her use against everyone who'd ever crossed. Everything I did was to protect this family, she said, her voice shaking but determined. Rose filled your head with fantasies about art and creativity, and following your dreams. I gave you reality. I gave you structure. I made you into someone worthy of marrying into a family like the Townsend. The admission hit me like a physical blow. She'd stolen from me. For 10 years she'd stolen from me while making me feel guilty for every dollar I cost the family. Every time I'd wanted art supplies or books or anything that didn't fit her vision of who I should be, she'd made me feel selfish and ungrateful. Every time I'd suggested pursuing my passion for art, she'd reminded me how expensive my education had been, how much the family had sacrificed for me. How could you? I whispered. But Victoria wasn't finished. Her eyes blazed with the righteous anger of someone who believed her own justifications. You want to know how I could because Rose was filling your head with nonsense about being an artist, about following your heart instead of your head. I could because you were wasting your potential on charitable work and community centers when you could have been building connections that matter. I could because someone had to save you from yourself. The chapel was dead silent now except for the sound of my heart breaking. 300 guests watched as my mother systematically destroyed the foundation of everything I'd believed about my life. Marcus reached me and took my hands, his eyes blazing with protective fury. Natalie, I'm so sorry. If I'd known, you couldn't have known. Harrison interrupted, his voice gentler now as he looked at me. Because Victoria has been very careful to cover her tracks. It took my investigators months to unravel what she'd done: forged signatures, falsified documents, bribery of bank officials. It's an impressive criminal enterprise. Really? Criminal enterprise? Sophia spoke for the first time, her voice small and scared. Mom, what is he talking about? Victoria whirled on her younger daughter. I'm talking about securing our family's future. Do you think we could have afforded your private school, your college, this lifestyle, without that money? Do you think your sister would be standing here in a designer dress about to marry a billionaire if I hadn't invested in making her into someone worthy of it? By stealing from me, I said, and my voice was stronger now, cutting through her justifications like a sword. By making me believe I was a burden while you spent my inheritance on yourself. I spent it on all of us, Victoria screamed. And now she looked truly unhinged. Your education, this house, Sophia's opportunities, all of it came from making smart investments with money that would have been wasted on your artistic fantasies. Harrison stepped closer, and now his expression was implacable. Miss Brooks, you have exactly 1 minute to explain to my future daughter-in-law where her grandmother's ring is before I call the police. What ring? I asked, but I was already starting to remember. Grandmother Rose had always worn a distinctive emerald ring, an antique piece she'd claimed was worth more than most people's houses. She'd promised it would be mine someday. Victoria's face went from red to pale in seconds. I feel that ring was sold to pay for estate tax. It was necessary to preserve the other assets. The ring that's currently sitting in your jewelry box upstairs? Harrison asked mildly. The one my investigators photographed yesterday when they executed the search warrant for your home. The bottom fell out of Victoria's world, and I watched it happen in real time. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her hands trembled, and for the first time in my life, I saw my mother look truly helpless. Search warrant. Richard spoke for the first time, his voice hollow. Victoria, what have you done? But Harrison wasn't finished. He pulled out another document from his folder, this one with official seals and signatures. Natalie, I need you to know that your grandmother left you more than money. She left you a letter, one that your mother intercepted and hid. He handed me an envelope, yellowed with age, with my name written in grandmother's familiar handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it and began to read aloud, my voice carrying across the silent chapel. My dearest Natalie, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and someone has finally told you the truth about what I left you. I hope by now you know that you were never a burden, never unwanted, never less valuable than anyone else. The money is yours, but more importantly, the choice is yours. Choose love, choose art, choose whatever makes your soul sing. Don't let anyone convince you that you need to earn your place in this world. You were born worthy of it. All my love, Grandmother Rose. I finished reading, and looked up to find 300 people staring at me, with expressions ranging from shock to sympathy, to barely concealed fascination. Marcus squeezed my hands, his face fierce with protective love. Natalie, he said quietly, we don't have to do this today. We can postpone, deal with all of this, and have our wedding when you're ready. I looked at him, this good, honest man who'd fallen in love with me, when he thought I was just a poor community center volunteer. This man, whose father had spent months investigating my family, not to protect his son's inheritance, but to protect me. Then, I looked at Victoria, who stood in the center aisle looking smaller and more desperate than I'd ever seen her. For a moment, I felt the old familiar tug of sympathy, the ingrained instinct to make excuses for her behavior, and find a way to smooth things over. But then I thought about 10 years of stolen money, 10 years of being made to feel guilty for wanting art supplies, 10 years of believing I was lucky that anyone would put up with me, let alone love me. Actually, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word, I think we should finish this ceremony, but first, I have something to say. I turned to face the assembled guests, still holding Marcus's hand, still wearing my grandmother's dress, the wedding dress of a woman who'd believed in love and truth, and the courage to stand up for what was right. My name is Natalie Brooks, I began, and I want you all to know that I'm not marrying Marcus Townsend for his money. In fact, as it turns out, I don't need his money. What I need is his love, his partnership, and his commitment to building a life based on honesty and mutual respect. I looked directly at Victoria. I also want you all to know that forgiveness isn't about pretending someone didn't hurt you. It's about refusing to let their choices define your future. My mother stole from me, lied to me, and tried to convince me I was worthless, but I'm not worthless. I never was. The chapel was so quiet, I could hear birds singing in the trees outside. Harrison smiled at me with something that looked like pride, and Marcus's eyes were bright with tears. Now, I said, turning back to the minister, who'd been standing frozen at the altar throughout this entire drama, I believe we have a wedding to finish. Victoria collapsed back into her seat, her face buried in her hands. Sophia moved to sit beside her, confusion and hurt written across her features. Richard stood in the back, his face gray with shock and shame. But Marcus and I walked to the altar hand in hand, ready to make promises based on truth instead of deception, love instead of obligation. Harrison Townsend had given me more than my inheritance back. He'd given me my life back, and this was only the beginning of the story. The ceremony concluded in a haze of whispered conversations and sideways glances. When the minister finally pronounced us husband and wife, Marcus kissed me with a tenderness that felt like a promise that everything would be different now. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The applause was scattered and uncertain, nothing like the joyous celebration we'd planned, but I found I didn't care. Truth had a way of making everything else feel secondary. As we walked back down the aisle together, I caught glimpses of guests' faces. Some looked scandalized, others sympathetic, and a few appeared genuinely angry on my behalf. Mrs. Pemberton from the Historical Society shot Victoria a look that could have withered magnolias, while Judge Richardson, an old family friend of the Townsends, shook his head in obvious disgust. Victoria remained seated, her shoulders shaking with what might have been sobs or rage. Sophia sat beside her, one hand on our mother's back, her young face cycling through confusion, embarrassment, and something that looked like dawning realization. Richard had disappeared entirely, probably to avoid the photographers who were already circling like vultures. Harrison fell into step beside us as we exited the chapel. Natalie, I know this isn't how you plan to spend your wedding day, but we need to discuss next steps. The authorities will want to speak with you, and there are financial documents that require your immediate attention. I nodded, though part of me felt like I was floating outside my body, watching someone else's life unfold. How long have you known? I started investigating about 6 months ago, Harrison admitted. Something about your mother's story never sat right with me. When Marcus told me you worked at a community center because you couldn't afford to pursue art, but then I saw the quality of your work at that charity auction, the pieces didn't fit. Artists with your talent don't usually come from families struggling financially, not unless something else is going on. Marcus squeezed my hand. I should have seen it too, the way your mother always controlled every conversation about money, how she made you feel guilty for the smallest expenses. I thought it was just her personality, but now, you couldn't have known, I said, and meant it. She's been perfecting this performance for 10 years. She had everyone convinced, including me. The reception area had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, with crystal chandeliers casting rainbow patterns across tables laden with flowers and fine china. The irony wasn't lost on me that it was all paid for with Townsend money, while my own inheritance had been funding my mother's lifestyle for a decade. Rachel appeared at my elbow, looking frazzled but determined. The photographer wants to know if you're still doing pictures, and the caterers are asking about the timeline for dinner service. Half the guests are milling around asking questions, and, she lowered her voice, there are reporters trying to get past security. Marcus's jaw tightened. Already, Harrison sighed. Word travels fast in Charleston society. By tomorrow, this will be front-page news. Victoria Brooks isn't exactly unknown in social circles, and financial fraud makes for compelling headlines. I looked around at the beautiful reception space, at the guests who were supposed to be celebrating our love but were instead gossiping about my family's criminal activity. Part of me wanted to flee, to grab Marcus and escape to somewhere no one knew our name. But another part, a part that was growing stronger by the minute, refused to be chased away from my own wedding reception. We're staying, I decided. We're going to have dinner, cut the cake, and dance. If people want to gossip, they can do it while watching us celebrate. Marcus smiled, and it was the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since his father had dropped his bombshell. I love you, Mrs. Townsend. Mrs. Townsend. The name felt foreign and wonderful at the same time. I was no longer Natalie Brooks, daughter of a woman who'd stolen my inheritance and convinced me I was worthless. I was Natalie Townsend, wife of a man who loved me for exactly who I was. The next few hours passed in a surreal blur. We posed for pictures in the garden, the photographer diplomatically avoiding any shots that might include Victoria, who had finally been convinced to leave by Sophia and a very stern-looking Aunt Claire. Guests approached cautiously to offer congratulations, their eyes bright with curiosity about the drama they'd witnessed. During cocktail hour, I found myself surrounded by a small group of women I'd never met, all of them married to business associates of Harrison. They spoke in the careful tones of people trying to extract information without appearing too eager. "Such a beautiful ceremony, dear," said a woman in an elaborate hat, who'd introduced herself as Mrs. Fairweather. "Though quite eventful, you must be devastated about your mother's situation." "Actually," I replied, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, "I feel liberated. Turns out being lied to for 10 years takes more of a toll than you realize until it stops." Mrs. Fairweather blinked rapidly, clearly not expecting such directness. "Oh, well, I'm sure it's all a misunderstanding. These financial matters can be so complicated. Forged signatures tend to be pretty straightforward," I said pleasantly, "but thank you for your concern." I excused myself and moved toward the head table, where Marcus was deep in conversation with his mother Eleanor. She was a gracious woman in her late 50s, with silver hair and kind eyes that had always made me feel welcome. Unlike Victoria, Eleanor had never made me feel like I needed to prove my worth. "Natalie, darling," she said, rising to embrace me, "I'm so sorry you had to go through that." Harrison told me some of what he'd discovered, but seeing it play out like that, she shook her head. "Your mother's actions are inexcusable. Thank you, I said, and found that I meant it. I know this isn't exactly the quiet family wedding we'd planned. Eleanor laughed, a sound like silver bells. Honey, the Townsend family hasn't had a quiet anything in 3 generations. At least your drama involved actual criminal activity instead of just garden variety family dysfunction. Marcus chuckled, some of the tension finally leaving his shoulder. Remember Cousin Bradley's wedding where Uncle Philip got drunk and challenged the minister to a debate about predestination? Or Aunt Margaret's third wedding where her second husband showed up to object during the ceremony? Eleanor added, honestly, a little financial fraud is almost refreshing by comparison. Their easy acceptance of chaos felt like a warm blanket. This was what family was supposed to feel like, I realized. Not the careful performance of affection I'd grown up with, but genuine love that didn't depend on meeting impossible standards. Dinner was announced, and guests began finding their seats. I noticed that several tables were noticeably emptier than they'd been during the ceremony. Apparently, some people preferred their scandals at a distance. The remaining guests, however, seemed determined to enjoy themselves despite, or perhaps because of, the unexpected entertainment. Harrison stood to offer a toast, his commanding presence immediately quieting the room. Today we've witnessed something extraordinary, he began, his voice carrying easily across the reception hall. Not just the union of 2 people who love each other, but the triumph of truth over deception, courage over fear. He raised his glass toward Marcus and, Natalie, you've shown remarkable grace under circumstances that would have broken many people. You've discovered that you're far stronger and more valuable than anyone ever told you, and I couldn't be prouder to welcome you into our family. The applause this time was genuine and sustained. I felt tears prick my eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming sensation of being truly seen and valued for the first time in my adult life. As the evening progressed, I found myself thinking about all the times Victoria had made me feel guilty for wanting things. Art supplies had been expensive frivolities. My desire to study abroad had been selfish indulgence. Even my volunteer work at the community center had been dismissed as playing with poor children instead of building meaningful connections. Every criticism, every subtle put-down, every moment she'd made me feel like a burden had been funded by my own money. Money my grandmother had left specifically for me to pursue my dreams and build the life I want. You're thinking too hard, Marcus observed, appearing beside me with 2 slices of wedding cake. I can practically see the wheels turning. I accepted the cake and took a bite of the lavender honey creation we'd chosen together. I'm thinking about all the times she convinced me I couldn't afford something, couldn't pursue something, because it would be too expensive for the family. Art classes, that photography workshop I wanted to take, even my suggestion that we donate more to the community center. She made me feel selfish for wanting any of it. While spending your inheritance on designer suits and country club memberships, Marcus said grimly, the audacity is breathtaking. It's more than audacity, I realized. It's systematic control. She didn't just steal my money, she stole my confidence, my sense of self-worth, my belief that I deserved to pursue my passions. She convinced me that wanting things was selfish, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of affection and opportunity she decided to give me. Marcus set down his cake and turned to face me fully. Natalie, you know that's over now, right? You never have to feel guilty for wanting things again. You never have to ask permission to pursue your dreams, or justify your choices to anyone. The simple statement hit me like a revelation. I was 28 years old, married to a wonderful man, and apparently worth several $1,000,000. I could take any art class I wanted, I could travel, donate to causes I cared about, buy art supplies without calculating whether I could afford groceries after. I could live without the constant background hum of financial anxiety that had colored every decision I'd made since college. I want to expand the community center, I said suddenly. The art program there is practically non-existent because they can't afford supplies or instructors. Kids come in after school with nowhere else to go, and we give them snacks and supervision but not much else. With proper funding, we could offer real programming, art classes, music lessons, college prep support. Marcus's eyes lit up. That sounds incredible. Do you have any idea what kind of budget you'd need? I've been thinking about it for years, I admitted. I even wrote up a proposal once, but I never submitted it, because I knew we couldn't afford it. But now, I paused, the reality still feeling impossible. Now I actually could fund it myself. We could fund it, Marcus corrected gently. We're a team now. Remember, my resources are your resources, and vice versa. The generosity of the statement took my breath away. Here was a man who'd grown up with unlimited wealth, offering to share it with someone he'd believed was essentially penniless. Meanwhile, my own mother had stolen from me for a decade while making me feel like a financial burden. As the reception wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself standing on the terrace overlooking the plantation's gardens. The September evening was perfect, with a slight breeze carrying the scent of jasmine, and the distant sound of jazz music drifting from the nearby river district. Sophia appeared beside me, her face tear-stained and exhausted. "Nat, I need to talk to you." I turned to study my sister's face. At 25, she'd always seemed so confident, so sure of her place in the world. Tonight, she looked lost and young, like the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. "I didn't know," she said urgently, "about the money, about what she did to you. I swear I had no idea." "I believe you," I said, and Sophia might have been Victoria's favorite, but she wasn't cruel. She'd simply been protected from the truth in a way I never was. "But I should have seen it," she continued, her voice breaking. "All those times she made you feel bad about spending money, while I got everything I wanted without question. I should have wondered where it was all coming from. I should have stood up for you more." I reached out and took her hand. "Sophie, you were a kid for most of, and even as an adult, you couldn't have known about the inheritance. Mom made sure of that." "What happens now?" she asked. "To her, I mean, and to our family." I considered the question. Harrison had mentioned authorities wanting to speak with me, which suggested criminal charges were likely. Victoria had committed fraud on a substantial scale, and there would be consequences. As for our family, I wasn't sure there was much left to salvage. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I do know that whatever happens, it's not your fault. You don't have to choose sides or fix anything. Mom made these choices, and she'll have to live with the consequences." Sophia nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I love you, Nat. I know I don't say it enough, but I do, and I'm proud of how you handled today. I don't think I could have been that strong." "You're stronger than you think," I told her. "We both are. We just never had the chance to find out before." After Sophia left to check on our father, I remained on the terrace, processing the events of the day. This morning, I'd been Natalie Brooks, dutiful daughter and grateful bride to be. Tonight, I was Natalie Townsend, heiress and crime victim, and survivor all at once. Marcus found me there as the last guests were leaving, loosening his tie and rolling up his sleeves. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Townsend?" "Home?" I repeated, testing the word. We'd planned to spend our wedding night at the Townsend estate on Kiowa Island, before flying to Tuscany for our honeymoon. It seemed surreal that we were still going through with those plans after everything that had happened. "Actually," I said, "I think I want to go to my apartment first. There are things there I want to see with new eyes, and I need to call work tomorrow to let them know I'll be taking some time off." Marcus nodded understanding. "Whatever you need, we have the rest of our lives to figure everything else out." As we drove through Charleston's quiet streets toward my small apartment in the French Quarter area, I thought about the conversation I'd have with my boss at the community center. I'd been working there for 3 years, pouring my heart into programs for at-risk youth, while always being limited by budget constraints. Tomorrow, I'd tell them I wanted to fund a major expansion. I'd offer to endow art and music programs, to hire additional staff, to provide scholarships for kids who wanted to pursue creative careers. I'd use my grandmother's money the way she'd intended, to help people pursue their dreams instead of being told those dreams were too expensive or impractical. Victoria had spent 10 years trying to convince me that I needed to earn my place in the world, that love and opportunity were finite resources I had to compete for. But Grandmother Rose's letter had reminded me of something I'd forgotten. I was born worthy. Everyone was. The apartment felt different when we walked in, though nothing had changed since that morning. It was still small and modest, furnished with pieces I'd collected from thrift stores and estate sales. But now, Instead of seeing evidence of my limited means, I saw evidence of my creativity and resourcefulness. I'd made a beautiful home with almost nothing, which meant I could make an extraordinary life with the resources I now knew I had. Marcus helped me out of my wedding dress, his hands gentle and reverent as he worked the buttons Rose had sewn decades earlier. The dress would go to the preservation specialist tomorrow, to be cleaned and stored properly for future generations. Maybe someday I'd have a daughter who'd want to wear it, to feel connected to the great-grandmother who'd believed in love and truth and the courage to stand up for what was right. As I changed into comfortable clothes, Marcus called room service from the hotel where we'd originally planned to stay, arranging for them to deliver dinner to the apartment instead. It seemed fitting somehow to spend our first night as husband and wife in the place where I'd lived independently, where I'd built a life on my own terms despite Victoria's best efforts to control me. Over pasta and wine on my tiny balcony, we talked about practical matters. Marcus would help me hire lawyers to sort through the legal implications of Victoria's theft. We'd work with financial advisors to understand exactly what I'd inherited and how to manage it responsibly. We'd still take our honeymoon, but we'd cut it short to deal with the inevitable media attention and criminal proceedings. "Are you angry?" Marcus asked, as we shared tiramisu and watched boats move along the Cooper River in the distance. I considered the question. I thought I'd be furious, heartbroken, devastated, and maybe I will be, when the shock wears off. But right now, I mostly feel free. Free. For 10 years I've been carrying around this weight of guilt and unworthiness that I didn't even realize was there. Every decision I made was filtered through this belief that I was too expensive, too needy, too much trouble. Tonight I found out that was all a lie. I'm not a burden. I never was. Marcus reached across the small table and took my hand. "You're extraordinary. You built a meaningful life and maintained your sense of compassion and creativity, despite being systematically undermined by someone who was supposed to protect you. That takes incredible strength." As the evening grew late and we prepared for bed, I realized that this was the end of one story and the beginning of another. The girl who'd believed she needed to earn love was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her worth, who had resources to pursue her dreams, and who was married to a man who saw her value from the very beginning. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and reporters and difficult conversations with authorities. There would be court proceedings, and media scrutiny and the complicated process of rebuilding relationships with family members who'd been kept in the dark about Victoria's crime. But tonight I was simply Natalie Townsend, sleeping in my own bed beside the man I loved, dreaming about art programs and scholarships and all the ways I could use my unexpected inheritance to help other people pursue their own dreams. Victoria had tried to steal my future. Instead, she'd forced me to claim it. The morning sun streaming through my apartment windows felt different somehow, charged with possibility in a way that made everything look sharper and more vivid. I woke up to find Marcus already dressed and on the phone in the kitchen, his voice low and professional as he spoke with someone about legal matters. The reality of yesterday's revelations settled over me like a heavy blanket, but underneath the weight was something I'd never felt before: complete freedom from financial fear. I padded to the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me had the same green eyes and dark hair, the same freckles across her nose, but something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't calculating the cost of basic necessities. I wasn't wondering if I could afford the good shampoo, or whether that art supply purchase would mean eating ramen for a week. The constant background hum of financial anxiety that had colored every decision for 10 years was simply gone. Marcus appeared in the doorway with a cup of coffee, his hair still rumpled from sleep. "James Morrison is coming by at 10, he said, referring to Harrison's attorney. "He's bringing documents for you to review and sign. Apparently, getting access to your inheritance is going to be more complicated than we thought." I accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. Even something as simple as buying good coffee beans had been a luxury I'd often denied myself. "Complicated." "Victoria was thorough," Marcus said grimly. "She didn't just forge your signature on the initial transfer documents. She's been impersonating you for years, signing new papers, moving money between accounts, even filing tax returns in your name. Untangling it all is going to take time." The audacity was staggering. It was one thing to steal money, it was another to systematically assume someone's entire financial identity. How is that even possible? Wouldn't banks have required identification? That's what we're going to find out. But James mentioned something about falsified documents and possibly bribed bank officials. Your mother apparently has connections we didn't know about. I thought about Victoria's network of social and business relationships, the careful way she'd cultivated influence over the years. I'd always assumed it was simply her personality, her need to be at the center of every important conversation. Now I wondered if it had been strategic, building a web of people who owed her favors, or who could be convinced to look the other way when needed. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. Reporters have been calling the center asking about you. Want me to handle them or send them somewhere else? I showed the message to Marcus, who frowned. It's starting already. By this afternoon, this story will be everywhere. What exactly will they be reporting? I asked, suddenly nervous about the prospect of having my private business dissected in public. Prominent Charleston socialite accused of massive fraud against her own daughter, theft during billion-dollar family wedding. It has all the elements that sell newspapers, Marcus said. The question is how much detail Harrison's investigators are willing to share with the press. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone rang with Harrison's number. I answered cautiously, still not entirely comfortable with my new father-in-law despite his actions on my behalf. Natally, good morning. I hope you're both doing well considering yesterday's events. Harrison's voice was crisp and businesslike, even at 8 in the morning. I wanted to give you a heads up about what's coming. The Charleston Post and Courier is running a front-page story this morning, and I've had calls from 3 other news outlets since dawn. My stomach dropped. What are they saying? The facts, mostly. Victoria Brooks accused of forging documents to steal inheritance from daughter, the amounts involved. The timeline, they're treating it as a straight financial crime story for now, but that could change. Change how? There was a pause that made me uneasy. They've started digging into Victoria's business dealing, the interior design firm, the foundation board positions, the social connections. If they find a pattern of financial irregularities beyond just your inheritance, this could become much bigger. I sank onto the couch, suddenly understanding that this was about more than just my family drama. If Victoria had been stealing from me for years, if she'd been forging documents and bribing officials, it was possible I wasn't her only victim. Harrison, I said slowly, do you think she's done this to other people? I think, he said carefully, that someone who's capable of systematically defrauding her own daughter for a decade is probably capable of other things. And I think the authorities are going to be very interested in finding out what those other things might be. After we hung up, Marcus and I sat in silence for a long moment. The magnitude of what was unfolding began to sink in. This wasn't just about getting my inheritance back. It was about uncovering what might be years or decades of criminal activity. I need to call work, I said finally, and then I think we should go see my father. Richard Brooks lived alone now in the house I'd grown up in, a modest Victorian in the historic district that had always felt too small for Victoria's ambition. Marcus and I drove there after meeting with James Morrison, who'd presented me with a stack of documents that painted an even more disturbing picture of my mother's activities. The forgeries weren't limited to my inheritance. Victoria had been using my social security number to open credit accounts, had listed me as a business partner in ventures I'd never heard of, and had even applied for loans using falsified income statements in my name. I was lucky the credit hadn't been ruined, but only because she'd been making payments using my own stolen money. Richard answered the door looking like he'd aged a decade overnight. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. The confident professor who'd once commanded lecture halls had been replaced by a broken man who seemed to have trouble meeting my gaze. Natalie, he said, his voice hoarse. Marcus, please, come in. The house felt different without Victoria's commanding presence. Smaller somehow, but also more peaceful. The tension that had always hummed through these rooms was gone, replaced by an echoing sadness that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. We sat in the living room where I'd spent countless evenings doing homework while Victoria made phone calls and planned social events. The space was exactly as I remembered, except for the absence of family photos. I noticed they'd been removed from their usual spots on the mantel and side table. Dad, I began gently. We need to talk about what happened yesterday, about what Mom did. Richard's hands shook as he poured coffee from a service that had been a wedding gift decades earlier. I didn't know, he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. About the inheritance, about the forgeries, about any of it. You have to believe me, Natalie. I would never have let her do that to you. I studied his face, looking for signs of deception, but finding only genuine anguish. How could you not know? You handled the family finances for years. Not after your grandmother died, he admitted. Victoria said Rose's affairs were complicated, that she needed to handle everything herself because she understood the legal implications better. She took over all the financial management, said it was too much stress for me on top of my teaching load. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into play. Victoria hadn't just stolen my inheritance, she'd systematically isolated Richard from any knowledge of the family's finances, ensuring that no one could question her story or discover her crimes. She showed me forged documents, Richard continued, his voice breaking, papers that supposedly showed Rose had left everything to the family business, with provisions for your education, but nothing else. She said your grandmother had been worried about giving young people too much money too soon, that she wanted you to earn your way. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Victoria had used my grandfather's actual concerns about spoiled children against me, twisting Rose's love and wisdom into a justification for theft. Dad, how long has she been controlling the finances? Since right after Rose died, maybe 10 years now. He looked up at me with eyes full of shame. I should have questioned it more, should have insisted on seeing the original documents. But Victoria was so certain, so organized, and I was grieving and overwhelmed. It was easier to let her handle everything. Marcus leaned forward. Miss Brooks, we're not here to blame you, but we need to understand the full scope of what Victoria did. The authorities are going to have questions, and the more information we can provide, the better. Richard nodded shakily. What do you need to know? Everything. How she explained the sudden improvement in our family's financial situation, where she said the money for Sophia's private school and your renovations came from, why she was able to afford designer clothes and country club memberships on a professor's salary. Over the next hour, Richard painted a picture of systematic deception that was even more elaborate than I'd imagined. Victoria had told him that Rose's estate had included valuable antiques and artwork that she'd been quietly selling over the years. She'd claimed that her interior design business was more successful than it appeared, with wealthy clients who preferred discretion. She'd even invented a story about a small inheritance from a distant relative to explain particularly large expenditure. She had an answer for everything, Richard said miserably, and I wanted to believe her. Life was so much easier when she handled all the financial stress, when I could focus on my students and my research without worrying about money. I felt a surge of sympathy for my father, even as part of me wanted to shake him for his willful blindness. He'd been as much a victim of Victoria's manipulation as I had, just in a different way. There's something else, Richard said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Yesterday, after we left the reception, Victoria told me there were other accounts, other financial arrangements I didn't know about. She said if everything came out, it would destroy more than just our family. Marcus and I exchanged glances. What did she mean by that? I don't know. She was hysterical, barely making sense, but she kept saying she'd done things to protect other people, that if the investigators kept digging, they'd find connections that would hurt innocent families. A chill ran down my spine. If Victoria had been stealing from or defrauding other people, my decision to expose her had implications far beyond just getting my own money back. There might be other victims, other families dealing with financial crimes they didn't even know had been committed against them. Dad, we need you to think carefully. Over the past 10 years, were there any friends or clients who mentioned financial problems? Anyone who seemed to have money troubles despite appearing wealthy? Any situations where Victoria offered to help with financial planning or legal matters? Richard's face went pale as he considered the question. Mrs. Whitmore, he said slowly, Dorothy Whitmore from the garden club. About 5 years ago, she was having problems with her late husband's estate. Victoria offered to introduce her to a financial advisor who specialized in complicated inheritances. Dorothy was so grateful, said Victoria had saved her from losing everything. Do you know what happened with Mrs. Whitmore's case? She moved away not long after. Victoria said the advisor had helped her restructure everything, but that Dorothy needed to relocate for tax purposes. We never heard from her again. Marcus pulled out his phone and started typing notes. We need to get this information to Harrison's investigators immediately. If there are other victims, they need to be contacted before more evidence disappears. As we prepared to leave, Richard grabbed my arm with desperate urgency. Natalie, what's going to happen to your mother, to our family? I looked at this man who'd raised me, who'd read me bedtime stories and helped with homework, and cheered at every school play, even when Victoria had made it clear my interests were frivolous wastes of time. He'd failed to protect me from her manipulation, but he'd also been manipulated himself. I don't know, Dad, but I know that hiding from the truth won't make any of this better. Victoria made choices, and there are going to be consequences. All we can do now is cooperate with the investigation and try to help anyone else who might have been hurt. The drive back to Marcus's family estate was quiet, both of us processing the growing realization that my inheritance theft might be just the tip of an iceberg. The Townsend property on Kiowa Island was breathtaking, with sprawling gardens and ocean views that should have felt like paradise. Instead, I found myself thinking about Dorothy Whitmore and whoever else might have trusted Victoria with their financial futures. Harrison met us in his study, a masculine room lined with law books and maritime artifacts that spoke to the family's shipping business route. He looked grim as he reviewed Marcus's notes from our conversation with Richard. I've already had my people start looking into Mrs. Whitmore's case, he said. What they've found so far isn't encouraging. Dorothy Whitmore died in a car accident 2 years ago in Arizona, where she'd moved after liquidating most of her assets. The financial advisor Victoria supposedly introduced her to doesn't exist. The words hit me like a physical blow. Are you saying my mother killed someone? I'm saying your mother may have convinced a vulnerable widow to transfer her assets to fictitious accounts, and that woman ended up dying alone, and possibly penniless in another state. Whether there's a direct causal relationship or not, the pattern is deeply troubling. Marcus reached for my hand as I struggled to process this new level of horror. It was one thing to discover that my mother had stolen from me. It was another to realize she might have systematically preyed on vulnerable people for years. How many others? I asked. Harrison opened a thick folder on his desk. We're just beginning to investigate, but based on Victoria's social connections and business relationships, there could be dozens. She had access to wealthy elderly clients through her interior design work, connections to recently widowed women through various social organizations, and a reputation for being helpful with financial matters that made people trust her. The scope of potential devastation was overwhelming. I thought about all the charity events and social gatherings I'd attended with Victoria over the years, watching her charm wealthy donors and recently bereaved spouses with her carefully practiced sympathy and offers of assistance. We need to go public with this, I said suddenly. Not just the story about my inheritance, but the possibility that there are other victims. People need to know what she's capable of, and other victims need to know they can come forward. Harrison looked surprised. Natalie, that's going to bring enormous scrutiny to your family. Every detail of your life will be examined. The media attention will be intense, and probably unpleasant. Good, I said, and meant it. If there are other Dorothy Whitmores out there, if there are other families who've been destroyed by my mother's crimes, they deserve justice. And they deserve to know that someone believes them and will fight for them. Marcus squeezed my hand. Are you sure about this? Once we open this door, there's no closing it again. I thought about the letter from my grandmother, about her words encouraging me to choose love and truth and courage. I thought about the community center where I worked, about kids who'd been told they didn't deserve opportunities or support. I thought about all the times Victoria had made me feel worthless while stealing my future to fund her own lifestyle. I'm sure my mother spent 10 years convincing me that I didn't deserve better, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of affection and opportunity she decided to give me. If there are other people out there who've been told the same lies, who've been made to feel like they deserve to be cheated and abandoned, then they need to know the truth. Harrison nodded slowly. Then we'll need to coordinate with law enforcement and prepare for a media strategy. This is going to become a very public fight, and Victoria isn't going to go down quietly. As if summoned by our conversation, Harrison's assistant knocked on the study door. "Sir, there's a call for you. It's Victoria Brooks's attorney. He says she wants to negotiate." Harrison's expression hardened. "Tell him I'll call him back in an hour, and get my prosecutor contact on the line. I think it's time to discuss immunity deals for witnesses who can provide information about other potential victims." The afternoon dissolved into a blur of phone calls and legal consultations. Marcus and I sat in the garden while Harrison and his team worked, trying to find moments of peace amid the growing storm. The ocean stretched endlessly before us, its rhythm a reminder that some things remained constant, even when your entire world was being turned upside down. "Do you regret it?" Marcus asked as we watched pelicans dive for fish in the surf. "Exposing all of this instead of just quietly getting your inheritance back." I considered the question carefully. 24 hours ago I would have done anything to avoid conflict, to keep peace in the family, to avoid making waves that might upset the delicate balance Victoria had constructed. That woman felt like a stranger now. "No," I said finally. "I regret that it took me so long to see what was happening. I regret that other people may have been hurt while I was too focused on trying to earn my mother's approval to notice the pattern, but I don't regret fighting back." As the sun began to set over the ocean, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that would have inspired dozens of paintings if I'd had my supplies with me, I made a mental note to buy a complete art studio once this was all settled. Not because I needed expensive materials to be creative, but because I could, because my grandmother had left me the resources to pursue beauty and meaning and creative expression without apologizing for the cost. Victoria had tried to steal more than my money. She'd tried to steal my sense of possibility, my belief that I deserved to pursue the things that brought me joy. Tomorrow, when we went public with the full scope of her crimes, I'd be reclaiming not just my inheritance, but my right to dream without limitation. The girl who'd felt guilty for wanting art supplies was gone. In her place was a woman who understood that generosity and creativity and the pursuit of beauty weren't luxuries to be rationed, but essential parts of a life lived fully. And for the first time in my adult life, I was ready to live that fully realized life, whatever the cost. The press conference was scheduled for 10 in the morning at the downtown Charleston courthouse, but by 8:30, news vans were already lining Broad Street, like a parade of vultures. I stood at the window of James Morrison's law office, watching reporters set up cameras and test microphones, while my stomach churned with a mixture of anticipation and dread. In 2 hours I would stand in front of those cameras and tell the world that my mother was not just a thief, but potentially a serial predator who had spent years targeting vulnerable people. Marcus appeared beside me with a cup of tea, his presence steady and calming in the chaos. "Harrison just got off the phone with Detective Chen. They've had 6 more people come forward since yesterday's preliminary story ran. 6 more families who think Victoria may have defrauded them." The number hit me like a punch to the chest. 6 more Dorothy Whitmore. 6 more families destroyed by my mother's systematic manipulation and theft. What did she take from them? Inheritances, mostly, life insurance payouts, an elderly man's entire retirement fund that he'd trusted her to help him manage after his wife died. Marcus's voice was tight with controlled anger. "The pattern is always the same. She targets people who are grieving, overwhelmed or unfamiliar with financial matters. She offers to help, introduces them to fake advisors, or convinces them to sign documents they don't understand. Then the money disappears." I closed my eyes and tried to steady my breathing. When I'd made the decision to go public, I'd known it would be difficult. I hadn't fully grasped that I'd be giving voice to potentially dozens of victims whose lives had been shattered by the woman who raised me. "There's something else," Marcus said gently. "Detective Chen, wants to talk to you about Sophia. They think she might have unknowingly been used as part of Victoria's schemes. My eyes snapped open. What do you mean? Apparently, some of the fake investment documents bear Sophia's signature as a witness. If she was signing papers without understanding what they were, she could be facing charges as an accessory unless she cooperates fully with the investigation. The thought of my younger sister being dragged into this nightmare made my heart race. Sophia might have been Victoria's favorite, but she was also fundamentally innocent. She'd been protected from the harsh realities that had shaped my childhood, which meant she'd also been naive about the extent of our mother's manipulations. I need to call her, I said, reaching for my phone. Actually, Marcus said, she's here. She arrived about 20 minutes ago with Aunt Claire. They're waiting in the conference room. I found Sophia sitting at the long mahogany table, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup like it was an anchor. She looked exhausted and scared, nothing like the confident young woman who'd stood beside me at the wedding altar just 3 days ago. Aunt Claire, my father's sister, sat beside her with a protective expression that reminded me of a mother hen guarding her chick. Nat, Sophia said, rising to embrace me. I'm so sorry, about everything, about what Mom did to you, about not seeing it sooner, about all of it. I held her tightly, feeling the tremor in her shoulders that suggested she'd been crying. Sophie, none of this is your fault, you know that, right? Detective Chen doesn't seem to think so, Aunt Claire interjected, her voice sharp with worry. They've been asking about documents Sophia supposedly witnessed, business transactions she supposedly approved. They're treating her like she was complicit in Victoria's crime. I looked at my sister, studying her pale face and red-rimmed eyes. Sophie, what documents did Mom have you sign? I don't know, she said miserably. Over the years, she'd ask me to witness things, or sign papers for the business. She said it was just routine paperwork, that she needed family members as witnesses for legal reasons. I trusted her. I never read them carefully or asked questions. This was exactly what I'd feared. Victoria had used Sophia's trust and naivety against her, just as she'd used my desire for approval against me. The difference was that Sophia's signatures might have helped legitimize fraudulent documents, which could make her legally liable even if she'd acted innocently. We need to get you a lawyer, I said, someone separate from the team handling my case, someone whose only job is protecting you. Sophia shook her head. I can't afford that kind of attorney, and with everything coming out about Mom, I don't even know if I'll have a job next week. Half our clients are probably going to fire the design firm as soon as they see the news. Without hesitation, I said, I'll pay for it. Whatever legal representation you need, whatever this costs, I'll handle it. Natalie, you can't, Sophia protested. That's not your responsibility. Yes, it is, I said firmly. Victoria used both of us in different ways. She stole my inheritance and she manipulated you into unknowingly helping her commit crimes. We're both victims here, and I have the resources to make sure we both get justice. Aunt Claire looked between us with an expression of sadness and pride. You girls shouldn't have to be dealing with any of this. Victoria's choices aren't your burden to bear. Maybe not, I agreed, but they're our reality to navigate, and we're going to do it together. James Morrison appeared in the doorway, looking apologetic for the interruption. Natalie, we need to go over your statement one more time before the press conference, and Detective Chen is here with some new information. Detective Sarah Chen was a compact woman in her 40s, with intelligent eyes and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd seen enough criminal behavior to be surprised by very little. She shook my hand with a firm grip and got straight to business. Miss Townsend, thank you for agreeing to go public with this. Since yesterday's story broke, we've had a flood of calls from potential victims, but we've also had some concerning developments regarding your mother's current whereabouts. My blood ran cold. What do you mean? Victoria Brooks failed to appear for her scheduled interview with our department this morning. Her attorney claims she's suffering from a medical emergency and has been hospitalized, but when we contacted the hospital, they have no record of her admission. Marcus leaned forward. Are you saying she's fled? We're saying we can't locate her at this time. We've issued a BOLO alert, and we're monitoring her credit cards and bank accounts, But someone with her knowledge of financial systems and document forgery has several advantages when it comes to disappearing. The implications hit me immediately. If Victoria had run, it meant she knew the full scope of what the investigation would uncover. It meant there were probably even more victims than we'd discovered so far. And it meant that some of those victims might never get their money back if she'd successfully hidden it in offshore accounts or converted it to untraceable assets. What about the money? Sophia asked, voicing the question I was afraid to ask. The money she stole from Natalie and the others, can it be recovered? Detective Chen's expression was grim. We're working with federal authorities and international banking specialists to trace the financial trail, but if Victoria has been planning this escape for months or years, she may have successfully laundered the majority of the stolen funds. The words felt like a physical blow. It was one thing to learn that my mother was a criminal. It was another to realize that her victims might never be made whole, that families like Dorothy Whitmore's might have lost everything with no hope of recovery. However, Detective Chen continued, your decision to come forward has given us the best chance we've had to build a comprehensive case. The more public attention this receives, the more likely we are to find additional victims and uncover the full scope of the fraud network. She looked directly at me. Are you prepared for what that means? The media attention, the scrutiny, the possibility that this investigation could take years to resolve. I thought about the families who had trusted my mother, about elderly widows and grieving spouses who had been targeted at their most vulnerable moments. I thought about my grandmother's letter, about choosing courage over comfort. I'm prepared, I said. Whatever it. The press conference was held on the courthouse steps, with me standing behind a podium flanked by Harrison's legal team and Detective Chen. The crowd of reporters was larger than I'd expected, with cameras from local and national news outlets capturing every word. I could see curious onlookers gathering on the sidewalks, and several people who looked like they might be potential victims clutching old documents and photographs. I began by reading a prepared statement that outlined the basics of Victoria's theft of my inheritance and the discovery of additional victims. But as I spoke, I found myself deviating from the script, speaking directly to the cameras about the emotional impact of financial fraud. My mother didn't just steal money from me, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. She stole my sense of self-worth. She convinced me that I was a burden, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of affection and opportunity she decided to give me. She used my love for her against me, making me complicit in my own victimization by teaching me to feel guilty for wanting anything. I could see people in the crowd nodding, recognizing their own experiences in my work. If you trusted someone with your finances and then found yourself struggling despite what should have been secure resources, you might be a victim too. If someone convinced you to sign documents you didn't understand, or introduced you to financial advisors who turned out not to exist, or helped you make investments that seemed to disappear without explanation, please come forward. The questions from reporters came fast and sharp. They wanted to know about the wedding day confrontation, about Harrison's investigation, about my relationship with Sophia and Richard. But the question that hit hardest came from a young female reporter in the back. Miss Townsend, some people might say that as a wealthy woman married to a billionaire, you don't need the money your mother stole. Why pursue this so aggressively instead of just moving on with your life? The question revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what this was about, but I could see how others might view it the same way. To someone looking from the outside, it might seem like I was being vindictive or greedy. This isn't about the money, I said, looking directly into the camera. This is about justice for people who may not have my resources or platform. Dorothy Whitmore died alone in Arizona after losing everything to my mother's schemes. There are elderly people sitting in nursing homes right now wondering how their life savings vanished. There are families who couldn't afford their children's college education because someone they trusted betrayed them. I paused, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. I have the privilege of being able to fight back, of having lawyers and investigators and media attention. Most fraud victims don't have those advantages. If I don't use my platform to expose what happened and help others get justice, then I'm as complicit in their suffering as if I'd stayed silent about my own. After the press conference, we returned to Harrison's estate where a team of attorneys and investigators had set up what looked like a war room. Charts covered the walls showing financial connections and timelines. Boxes of documents were stacked on every available surface. Phone calls were being made to banks, government agencies, and potential victims around the country. The response has been overwhelming, James Morrison reported as we reviewed the afternoon's developments. We've had over 40 new potential victims contact the hotline. The FBI has officially taken over the case given the interstate nature of the crimes, and we've traced at least $3 million to accounts in the Cayman Islands. The numbers were staggering. If even half of the new reports proved legitimate, Victoria had stolen upwards of $15 million over the past decade. She hadn't just been targeting individuals, she'd been running what amounted to a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Sophia sat quietly in the corner, still processing the scope of our mother's crimes. Earlier she'd met with the criminal defense attorney I'd hired for her, who'd recommended full cooperation with authorities in exchange for immunity from prosecution. But cooperation meant providing details about every document she'd ever signed, every business meeting she'd attended, every conversation she'd overheard. "Sophie," I said gently, "how are you holding up?" She looked up with haunted eyes. "I keep thinking about all the times Mom praised me for being helpful, for signing papers without asking questions. She said it showed I trusted her judgment and supported the family business. Now I know I was helping her steal from people." "You were manipulated," I reminded her. "You were a victim too, just in a different way. But those people lost their money partly because I signed papers that made the fraud look legitimate. How do I live with that?" It was a question I couldn't fully answer, because I was still learning to live with my own complex feelings about Victoria's crimes. Part of me felt guilty for not seeing the pattern sooner, for not questioning her explanations about our family's financial situation. Part of me wondered if I could have prevented some of the later victims if I'd been more suspicious or investigative. Marcus joined our conversation, settling beside me on the couch with a tablet full of news coverage. "The story is spreading faster than we expected. It's trending on social media, and several major outlets are planning follow-up investigative pieces." He showed me a tweet that had been shared thousands of times. "If someone you trusted convinced you to sign financial documents you didn't understand, you might be a victim of the Victoria Brooks scam. Don't be ashamed to come forward. Financial fraud thrives on victims' silence and shame." "That's good, right?" Sophia asked. "The more attention this gets, the more likely other victims are to realize what happened to them." "Yes," I said. "But it also means Victoria is seeing all of this coverage. If she's really in hiding, she knows exactly how much we've uncovered and how many people are looking for her." As if summoned by our conversation, Detective Chen called with an up. Victoria's credit cards had been used that morning at an airport hotel in Miami, but by the time authorities arrived, she was gone. Security cameras showed her checking out early and getting into a taxi, but the trail ended there. "She's definitely running," Detective Chen confirmed. "But she's also making mistakes, using her credit cards, staying in places with security cameras. People who are good at financial fraud aren't always good at physical escape." "What happens if she makes it out of the country?" I asked. "Depends on where she goes and whether we can establish extradition agreements, but financial fraud of this magnitude tends to attract international attention. She's not going to be able to hide forever." That evening, as Marcus and I sat on the terrace watching the sun set over the ocean, I felt the strange calm that comes after making an irreversible decision. 3 days ago, I'd been preparing for what I thought would be the happiest day of my life. Now I was at the center of a criminal investigation that was making national news. "Do you regret any of it?" Marcus asked, echoing the question he'd posed the day before. "No," I said, and realized I meant it completely. For the first time in my adult life, I feel like I'm living according to my own values instead of trying to earn someone else's approval. It's terrifying and liberating at the same time. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Saw you on the news. My grandmother lost her house because of your mother. Thank you for speaking up. Some of us thought we were alone." I showed the message to Marcus, feeling tears prick my eyes. This was why we were doing this. Not for the money, not for revenge, but for the people who had been told they were foolish, or careless, or unlucky when they were actually victims of a sophisticated predator. "There's something I want to do," I said suddenly. "With whatever money we recover, with my inheritance, with whatever resources we have, I want to create a foundation that helps fraud victims recover financially and emotionally. Legal support, counseling, financial education, assistance with rebuilding credit and lives." Marcus smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from him since the wedding. "That sounds perfect, exactly what your grandmother would have wanted." As night fell over the South Carolina coast, I thought about all the victims who might finally get justice, all the future targets who might be protected by our exposure of Victoria's methods. Tomorrow would bring new developments, new challenges, new revelations about the scope of the crime. But tonight, I was simply Natalie Townsend, a woman who had chosen truth over comfort, justice over peace, courage over fear. My mother had tried to steal my future, but instead, she had forced me to claim it in ways I never could have imagined. The girl who had been afraid to want things was gone. In her place was a woman ready to fight for what was right, whatever the cost. 18 months later, I stood in the gleaming lobby of the Charleston Financial Justice Center, watching families stream through the doors for our grand opening celebration. The building had once housed a failing bank, but we'd transformed it into something entirely different, a place where fraud victims could find legal help, financial counseling, and emotional support all under one roof. The irony of housing an anti-fraud center in a former bank wasn't lost on anyone, least of all the reporter from 60 Minutes, who was documenting our story. The past year and a half had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media attention, and personal growth that I could never have imagined. Victoria was currently serving a 15-year federal sentence in a minimum security prison in North Carolina, having been captured trying to board a cargo ship in Honduras with forged identification documents. The international manhunt had lasted 6 months, during which she'd managed to access hidden accounts in 3 different countries, before finally being apprehended. Through plea negotiations and asset forfeiture proceedings, we'd recovered nearly $12 million of the stolen funds, though investigators estimated the total theft was closer to $18 million. The recovered money had been distributed among 67 verified victims, with the remainder forming the endowment for the center I now ran. Marcus appeared beside me carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the proud smile that had become so familiar over these months of building something meaningful together. "Mrs. Patterson just finished giving her interview to the documentary crew," he said, referring to one of our success stories. "She wanted to thank you again for helping her get her late husband's pension money back." Eleanor Patterson had been one of Victoria's early victims, an elderly widow who'd trusted my mother to help manage a complex pension transfer after her husband's death. Victoria had convinced her to sign documents that transferred the entire pension to fraudulent accounts, leaving Mrs. Patterson destitute at 78 years old. Through our legal advocacy program, we'd been able to recover 80% of her stolen funds and help her secure proper financial management for the future. "How many families are we celebrating today?" I asked, looking around at the bustling lobby where victims, their families, volunteers and supporters mingled over refreshments. 43 families have gotten significant financial recovery through our advocacy program, Marcus said. Dozens more have received counseling, legal guidance, and financial education even when full recovery wasn't possible, and we've helped law enforcement identify and prosecute 3 other fraud networks, using similar methods to Victoria. The numbers were satisfying, but what moved me most were the individual stories. Like James Hendricks, a veteran who'd been convinced to invest his disability benefits in fake real estate ventures, or Maria Santos, a single mother who'd lost her children's college funds to a Ponzi scheme, run by someone posing as a family friend. Each person who walked through our doors represented not just financial crime, but the restoration of dignity and hope that fraud victims so desperately needed. "There's someone here to see you," Marcus added, his tone carefully neutral in a way that made me immediately alert. I followed his gaze to see a familiar figure standing near the information desk, Sophia looked sophisticated and confident in a way that reminded me of the woman she'd been becoming before Victoria's crimes derailed all our lives. She'd spent the past year rebuilding her career as an interior designer, this time building a reputation based on genuine talent rather than connections gained through fraud. Our relationship had been complicated as we'd both worked through the trauma of discovering who our mother really was, but slowly, carefully, we'd found our way back to being sisters. "Nat," she said, approaching with a tentative smile, "this place is incredible. You've really done something amazing here." "We've done something amazing," I corrected, because while Sophia hadn't been involved in the day-to-day operations, her testimony had been crucial in several prosecutions, and her decision to donate her portion of recovered funds to the center had made several programs possible. Sophia looked around at the bustling celebration, her eyes taking in the faces of people who'd found justice and support when they'd thought both were impossible. "I wanted to tell you that I visited Mom last week." The admission hung in the air between us. I'd chosen not to maintain contact with Victoria during her imprisonment, needing the emotional distance to heal and build my new life. Sophia had made a different choice, feeling obligated to maintain some connection despite everything that had happened. "How is she?" I asked, and was surprised to find that I genuinely wanted to know. "Angry, mostly. She still insists that everything she did was to protect the family, to give us opportunities we wouldn't have had otherwise. She can't, or won't, acknowledge that she destroyed people's lives." Sophia's voice was sad but steady, "But she asked me to tell you something." I waited, not sure I wanted to hear whatever message Victoria had sent. "She said she's proud of what you've built here. She said you've become exactly the kind of person Grandmother Rose always believed you could be." Sophia's eyes filled with tears. "I know it doesn't make up for anything, and I know it might not mean anything to you, but I thought you should know." The words hit me in an unexpected way. For most of my life I'd craved Victoria's approval, her acknowledgement that I was worthy of love and investment. Now, having built a life based on my own values and choices, her approval felt both meaningless and somehow healing. She could never undo the damage she'd caused, but perhaps some small part of her finally understood what she'd tried to destroy. "Thank you for telling me," I said, and meant it. "How are you doing with all of this?" "Better," Sophia said. "Therapy helped. And building something legitimate, something I can be proud of, that helps too. I'm working on a project actually, designing supportive housing for elderly people who've been victims of financial fraud. It's partly inspired by Mrs. Whitmore's story." Dorothy Whitmore's case had become a symbol for many of us of the human cost of financial fraud. Though she'd died before we could help her directly, her story had motivated several initiatives, including legislation making it easier for fraud victims to recover assets, and stronger penalties for those who targeted vulnerable populations. "That sounds perfect," I said. "Let me know if you need any connections or resources." As the afternoon progressed, I found myself moving through the center's various departments, checking on the programs that had grown from an idea born of trauma into a comprehensive support system. In the legal clinic, attorneys were working with clients to understand their rights and options. The Financial Counseling Center was helping people rebuild credit and create sustainable budgets after fraud-related losses. The support group meeting rooms buzzed with conversations between people who understood each other's experiences in ways that only fellow victims could. In my office, I kept 2 framed items on my desk. One was the letter from my grandmother Rose, the words about choosing love and courage now faded but still legible. The other was a photograph from our opening day, showing Mrs. Patterson cutting the ribbon while surrounded by other survivors and their families. Both reminded me daily why this work mattered. Harrison knocked on my office door around 4 o'clock, looking every inch the distinguished businessman but with the warm smile that had become familiar over the months of planning and building the center together. "The documentary crew wants to wrap up with an interview about what comes next," he said. "Are you ready for that?" I considered the question. What did come next? The center was established and thriving. Victoria was in prison and would likely remain there for many years. The immediate crisis had been resolved, the urgent needs addressed, but fraud continued to happen every day, and there were always more victims who needed help and support. "I think I am," I said, "but first, there's something I want to show you." I led him to the second floor, where we'd recently opened our newest program, an art therapy studio for trauma survivors. The room was filled with easels, art supplies, and natural light streaming through tall windows. Several people were working on paintings and sculptures, using creativity as a tool for processing their experiences and rebuilding their sense of self. This was the program I was most excited about, I admitted. When Victoria stole my inheritance, she wasn't just taking money, she was taking my ability to pursue art, to express myself creatively, to believe that beauty and meaning were worth investing in. Now we can offer that opportunity to other people who've had their dreams stolen. Harrison studied a painting that one of the participants had just finished, a vibrant seascape that seemed to capture both turbulence and hope. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said simply. The documentary interview took place in the center's main conference room, with the late afternoon light casting golden patterns across the table where so many victims had first told their stories and begun their journey toward justice. The reporter, a seasoned journalist who'd covered financial crime for decades, asked thoughtful questions about the broader implications of our work. "What do you want people to understand about financial fraud that they might not realize?" She asked. "That it's not just about money," I said. "When someone steals your financial security, they're stealing your ability to make choices about your future. They're stealing your sense of safety in the world." The psychological damage often lasts long after the financial problems are resolved. And what would you say to someone who might be experiencing financial fraud right now but isn't sure? Trust your instinct. If something feels wrong, if someone is pressuring you to make financial decisions quickly, or discouraging you from getting independent advice, if you're being told that questioning their guidance shows a lack of trust or appreciation, those are red flags. And know that if you are a victim, it's not your fault. Fraud works because criminals are skilled at exploiting normal human emotions like trust, love, and the desire to help family. "What's next for the Charleston Financial Justice Center?" I smiled, thinking about the expansion plans we'd been developing. "We're opening satellite offices in 3 other cities next year. We're launching an online education program to help people recognize and avoid fraud, and we're working with legislators to strengthen victim protection." And personally, what's next for Natalie Townsend? The question made me pause and consider how much my life had changed since that morning 18 months ago when I'd woken up thinking I was just a bride-to-be. I'd discovered I was an heiress, a crime victim, a public advocate, and a woman far stronger than I'd ever imagined possible. "I'm going to keep painting," I said. "That might sound trivial compared to everything else we've discussed, but it's not. My grandmother left me resources to pursue beauty and creativity, and Victoria tried to convince me that those pursuits were selfish or frivolous. Now I know that creativity and beauty and the courage to pursue what feeds your soul aren't luxuries, they're essential parts of a life lived fully." After the interview crew left, Marcus and I walked through the center one more time before locking up. The building was quiet now, but it hummed with the energy of lives being rebuilt and futures being reclaimed. In the art therapy studio, canvases were covered with paint, still drying, sculptures sat waiting for tomorrow's session, and the walls displayed finished pieces that told stories of survival and transformation. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Harrison hadn't investigated Victoria?" Marcus asked as we stood in the lobby, looking up at the donor wall where the names of recovered victims were displayed in elegant gold lettering. "I think about it sometimes," I admitted. "If he hadn't exposed her at our wedding, if I'd just gone on believing I was lucky to be tolerated by my own family. But I also think the truth has a way of surfacing eventually. Someone else would have gotten suspicious, or Victoria would have made a mistake, or one of her victims would have fought back, but it might have taken years longer. More people might have been hurt, maybe, but we can't live in the might have been. We can only work with what actually happened and try to make something meaningful from it." As we drove home through Charleston's historic streets, I thought about the letter I'd received that morning from a woman in Oregon, whose elderly father had been defrauded by someone using methods similar to Victoria. She'd written to thank me for speaking publicly about our experience and to let me know that our center's resources had helped her family recover a significant portion of their stolen funds. "You gave me permission to fight back," she'd written. "Before reading about your story, I thought we just had to accept what happened and move on. Now I know that fighting for justice isn't selfish or vindictive, it's necessary. That evening Marcus and I sat on our terrace overlooking the harbor, sharing a quiet dinner and watching boats navigate the familiar waters. The house we'd built together was filled with art, paintings I'd created in the months after Victoria's exposure, pieces by artists we'd discovered and supported, and works donated by participants in our art therapy program. Every room told a story of creativity chosen over constraint, beauty pursued without apology. "I have something for you," Marcus said, producing a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket. Inside was a delicate silver locket, antique but beautifully preserved. When I opened it, I found a tiny photograph of my grandmother Rose on one side and a miniature copy of her letter to me on the other. "I thought you might want to carry her words with you," Marcus said. "Since they started all of this." I fastened the locket around my neck, feeling the weight of it settle against my heart. Rose's belief in my worthiness had survived Victoria's attempts to destroy it, had flourished despite years of manipulation and theft, and had ultimately grown into something that could help others reclaim their own sense of value. "What do you think she would say about all of this?" I asked. Marcus considered the question. "I think she'd say you chose love over fear, truth over comfort, and courage over safety. I think she'd say you became exactly who she always knew you could be." As the sun set over Charleston Harbor, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that would have made perfect subjects for tomorrow's painting session, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. Victoria had tried to steal my inheritance, my confidence, my belief in my own worth. Instead, she'd forced me to discover reserves of strength I never knew I possessed. The girl who'd felt guilty for wanting art supplies was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that generosity and creativity, and the pursuit of justice, weren't luxuries to be rationed, but essential parts of a meaningful life. The daughter who'd craved approval from someone incapable of genuine love, had become a wife, advocate, and leader who knew her worth wasn't dependent on anyone else's recognition. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new victims seeking help, new opportunities to fight for justice and healing. But tonight, I was simply Natalie Townsend, sitting beside the man I loved, wearing my grandmother's words close to my heart, surrounded by beauty I'd chosen to create, rather than scarcity I'd been taught to accept. Victoria had spent years trying to convince me that I wasn't worthy of love, investment, or opportunity. In the end, she'd given me the greatest gift imaginable, the chance to prove her wrong, and help others do the same. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.